Hello, wellness students, and welcome to your week 15 lectures. Oh my gosh, you have just about made it. In this week's lecture series, it looks like, at the time I'm recording this, it's looking like we're going to have three fairly short lectures, nothing too intense this week. So, just as a reminder, we're in this section where we've been talking about emotional or mental wellness. And last week you had a little more in terms of lecture content. And, we started with just the basic intro, what emotional wellness is, how it gets defined, what does it involve. We talked about that those two tenets in the area of emotional or mental wellness. Those two tenets involved the ability to recognize and appropriately express feelings. And then the second tenet was related to it being better to be optimistic in one's approach to life. And then we also got started on the fight or flight response, definitions of stress, um, and just we started a little bit related to how stress potentially can impact the body. And with this first lecture, it's a bit of a continuation. But with this particular one, we're going to take a look more specifically at ways that stress, and in particular chronic or long-term stress, how it can potentially make you sick or negatively impact your health. So, when we left off in the last lecture this past week, um, we left off just beginning to look at these two types of stress, acute and chronic. And acute, again, is that really short-term stress. It's usually a very intense stressor. When it happens, your heart rate's going to spike, your respiration rate's going to spike, you're going to feel really afraid, but then it passes. Um, Acute stressors these days we're generally experience them if we feel as if we're in danger. I think the example I gave last week was late at night, dark, a car coming down the alley very rapidly towards you. That's usually going to end up being a really intense, short-lived stressor because I'm thinking you'll all jump out of the way and be okay. Um, that's a good example of an acute stressor. A chronic stressor, though, I think these are the types of stressors that a lot of us really get. We understand. We know we know and understand these stressors. Um, they can be related to a lot of different things I mentioned last week. That life change, because most people experience change, any kind of change, as a stressor. Life change often becomes a more chronic stressor. The process of change, is usually not a quick, short process. Um, Everything that's involved in change can sometimes end up meaning that it's weeks, months, maybe even years before we're moving completely through a change event. Chronic health problems can end up being, a chronic stressor. And for you guys, the type of stress that I'm thinking a lot of you can really relate to is stress associated with school. You know, and a lot of that stress is going to be related to your perceptions. Remember the power of perception, how you view something, how you see something, how you interpret the story that you tell yourself about, for example, school. Some people experience school as being very, very stressful. Other people don't. And there are various reasons for that. But, one big reason that can be going on is related to the story. What's your story in terms of school? Do you tell yourself that it is hard? Do you tell yourself that it's going to be impossible to get through it? If those are the kinds of stories we tell ourselves, we're going to experience school as being more stressful. Some people's perspective or view of school is that it's exciting, or that it's stimulating, or that it will be interesting. So, keep that in mind when it comes to those situations that you're experiencing as chronic stress. Be willing to take a look at how you're perceiving the situation and the story that you might be telling yourself. So here's where we left off last time, where we were talking about how, when we go through chronic or long-term stress, what's happening is that stress response, that fight or flight response, it's kicked in, but then it somewhat stays on or activated for a longer period of time. And that is where the problems can come from. Remember, the stress response, it does, there is this emotional and mental component of it, but there's also this physiological or physical component. The stress hormones have kicked in. You're getting increased levels of two in particular, cortisol and epinephrine. And so, with chronic or long term stress situations, we're walking around with higher levels of cortisol and epinephrine in our system. And that is the key reason we can potentially end up with health problems. So, the general adaptation syndrome, this is another one of those processes that will typically get presented to you when stress management is being discussed. That first process was the fight or flight response. And there were 4 stages with the fight or flight response. The fight or flight response is simply describing stimuli, the brain interpreting stimuli. If the brain decides that something is a threat, and then it explains in that 4th stage that as soon as the threat is over, the body returns to homeostasis. So it's just describing that process of how activation can occur and how our body will return to homeostasis. That's the fight or flight response. Now, the general adaptation syndrome, what it's attempting to explain or describe is how chronic stress can potentially impact our health, and that would be negatively impact our health. You will have questions on your final exam about the fight or flight response and the general adaptation syndrome. And from my experience in past semesters and with a lot of different classes, is that this is an area where students sometimes get confused and miss questions. And in this case, actually memorizing the fight or flight response and developing an understanding of what it is will help you remember it. So, you can memorize it, but if you really understand those 4 steps, the story that it's trying to tell, it'll help you remember it. Now, the general adaptation story is a little different. It's just saying, okay, this in general are the 3 steps for how stress can make us sick. Step 1 or stage 1 or phase 1 is something called the alarm reaction. And that's when the body system becomes activated. In other words, we have perceived something to be a stressor, okay? And what's happening is our nervous and endocrine systems have become activated. That fight or flight response has kicked in. So the alarm reaction is the fight or flight response kicking in. And here, once again, are those two hormones, those two stress hormones, epinephrine and cortisol. Those are two of the stress hormones that, when the fight or flight response kicks in, our body starts producing these hormones or releasing these hormones in larger quantities. Okay, so epinephrine, remember, it's also called adrenaline. Okay, stage two is referred to as the stage of resistance. Now, when this happens, our body actually is trying to revert back to physiological calm or homeostasis. It's kind of like our body, does want to move back into a balanced state. However, if the stressor continues or the threat persists, our body is going to stay activated. And when our body is staying activated, that means higher levels of the stress hormones in our system for that extended period of time, and also that one or more of our organs could be overworking, or one or more systems of the body are overworking. So think about this. If you go through a life change and you experience it as extremely stressful, and it's something that lingers to some degree for the next year, 2 years, 3 years, your physiology is going to be out of whack for an extended period of time. And that out of whack for an extended period of time is the stage of resistance. Things are overworking. You aren't in that spot physiologically that you're supposed to be. That's that healthy place of homeostasis. Now, eventually, what happens for all of us is stage three, the stage of exhaustion. And basically, in the stage of exhaustion, what's going on is something breaks, something gives. That's why I have this broken rope here. And I think the scary thing is we don't really know how long an individual's body can withstand a chronic stressor. And it's probably going to be different for all of us. But eventually, something does give. An organ can't keep up with being overworked, or a system of the body just can't do it anymore. So we get sick, or we have the onset of a disease, or it could be an underlying condition that we've had for some time gets worse. And so we're in a more, serious position with that. So remember the general adaptation syndrome. Understand the three phases or the three stages. And keep in mind, the general adaptation syndrome is attempting to describe how stress can potentially impact our health in a negative way, or how stress can make us sick. Okay, so one of those stress hormones is cortisol. And I just wanted to give you some examples of what higher levels of cortisol, the impact that they can have on our bodies. And again, think about, if you're under chronic or long-term stress, your levels of cortisol are going to be higher in your body. And so, increased levels of cortisol, they're linked to increased blood pressure, increased cholesterol, increased blood sugar. And this is one that I think, might perk up a lot of people, because we have so many challenges these days with diabetes in our society. Cortisol, what it actually does is it interrupts the body's ability to regulate blood sugar. So chronic stress through this cortisol connection can end up meaning we struggle more to regulate blood sugar, and we have increased blood sugar levels. Um, Cortisol is related to overeating and craving certain types of foods. The other thing that cortisol does that is just mind blowing to me, and fat, the fat on our bodies can actually become stored more so towards the abdominal area, especially deep in the abdominal area. Yeah, they found this not only in humans but also in primates that are chronically stressed. They tend to store more fat, or there's this kind of redepositing of fat into the abdominal area. And then, just the biggie is with cortisol is it tends to suppress or push down the functioning of the immune system. So, and I think when you see that cortisol suppresses the immune system, it's pretty easy to go, oh, okay, that's maybe why when I'm really stressed out, or after maybe it's a really stressful semester, you end the semester more likely to have a cold or flu. So, it could very well be that the impact of cortisol on your immune system has made you more vulnerable to that. Okay, so a few more slides here where we're going to look at some of the things that chronic stress can do to our body. We've already talked about how it weakens the immune system. With regard to cardiovascular disease, we talked about it being linked to high blood pressure. HBP is high blood pressure. Also, chronic stress is sometimes linked to abnormal heartbeats. That's called arrhythmia, problems with blood clotting and hardening of the arteries. That's arteriosclerosis. And by the way, research shows that this very same thing happens in primates as well. And I think that's always so interesting. They've actually shot pictures of the walls of arteries with primates, and the primates that are more highly stressed have greater buildup of plaque within the arteries. Remember that number one, or most commonly occurring symptom of stress, a physical symptom of stress, is muscle tension. And so if you're under chronic stress, you're going to also be experiencing chronic muscle tension. And with that chronic muscle tension, what also can oftentimes end up happening is chronic pain. And that's what this third one, that under muscle pain, is all about. Okay, stomach and intestinal problems. Chronic stress, it can be a factor with things like gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD, peptic ulcers. And by the way, peptic ulcers were the first physical symptom that was recognized in terms of the impact that stress can have on our body. So peptic ulcers and irritable bowel syndrome, it gets called IBS also. Stress can also have an impact on our reproductive system, our reproductive organs. It's linked to painful menstrual periods, decreased fertility. So, in other words, for women, what it's going to look like is it could become more difficult to become pregnant. And then for men, erection problems. In terms of the lungs, yes, stress can actually have an impact on the lungs, and especially if you already have respiratory conditions like asthma. If you're under chronic stress, the symptoms of asthma can get worse, or it could be the symptoms of any other respiratory condition. Also, if you have challenges with your skin, whether it's acne, psoriasis, eczema, it could be other types of rashes too. Chronic stress will tend to make that worse. And here are a couple of things that have been discovered just in more recent years with regard to the effect of chronic stress. Chronic stress tends to accelerate the aging process or increase the aging process. What's actually going on is when you're under chronic stress, the telomeres tend to shorten. So the length of the telomeres decreases. And the telomeres are the caps on the end of our chromosomes. And so there is an actual aging that goes on physiologically when we're experiencing chronic stress. And research in this area, one of the areas of research where they discovered this was they were looking at the mothers of children who had more severe disabilities. And mothers in general are a more highly stressed group. Um, but mothers who have children who have, real physical health challenges when they're born or other types of disabilities, um, the stress level of that particular grouping of mothers is usually much higher and it's long term. And so that's one of the cohorts or one of the groups that was studied when they were looking at chronic stress and the impact on the telomeres and the aging process. Also, stress makes you stupid. Um, Chronic stress is really hard on the hippocampus, and that's an area of your brain. The hippocampus, one of the things that the hippocampus gets associated with is learning and memory. And, I bet everyone at some point or another has really stressed their hippocampus out. If you pull an all-nighter studying for a test, you've just placed the hippocampus in a really vulnerable spot. You've really, it's a highly stressed hippocampus after attempting to stay up all night. And that means it's not actually going to be functioning as well. It's going to be harder for you to recall information, to remember the information you need to access on an exam. So, yeah, stress actually can make you stupid. Hey, we're going to end on with just a little bit of good news here. I have a hunch that a lot of you like to laugh and appreciate humor. I'm hoping all of you do. I wanted to leave you with this. Humor is actually good for us. And it can counteract some of the negative impacts of stress. So utilizing humor or tapping into our humor can be really important when we're going through stressful times. Humor actually lowers blood pressure, and it changes our biochemical state. Um, Laughter, it decreases the stress hormones. So if you're stressed, see if you can find a way to laugh. See if you can get yourself to get involved in something that will be humorous. And I bet you've all experienced it. You feel better when you laugh. But there are these underlying physical reasons also that you're feeling better. Laughter increases infection fighting antibodies. So, laughter is good for us. And also, laughter improves brain function. It stimulates both sides of the brain, or it should really be both hemispheres of the brain. And that means enhanced ability to learn. So, laughter is especially our friend when we're going through stressful times. And the key is finding those avenues that you enjoy, that you know uh, bring that sense of fun, humor, and laughter into your life. It will change your biochemical state. It changes your physiology when you laugh. Okay, so this is the end of your first lecture, and I will talk to you soon.